Hello. We're going to get started. Thank you all for your patience. As we all know, these rooms are coveted, so we appreciate you joining us today. Thank you all for joining us today for this very important event, and a warm welcome to all of those participating in the 58th sessions of the UNFCCC subsidiary body meeting. I am Mariana Panuncio Feldman, Country Engagement Director for the NDC Partnership, and I'll be moderating today's event. The International Energy Agency and the UNFCCC are holding this event, Energy Sector Pathways to the 1.5 degree goal, today to provide a comprehensive overview of the state of play in the global energy transition to ensure that net zero ambitions are met. We are confident that this event will not only provide an inspiration to raise ambition further, but also showcase key milestones for implementation informed by science in light of the Paris Agreement 1.5 degree goal. The event will feature opening remarks and keynote presentations, followed by a panel discussion with experts from diverse energy-related backgrounds. We'll open the floor to questions from the audience after that. So before getting us started, I wanted to let you know that unfortunately, His Excellency Mr. Mohammed Nasser, Ambassador to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Egypt, who was going to join us at the beginning of the event, is still in the negotiations and he cannot join us at present. But with that, we have a great group of experts who are going to lead us to the next segment. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce His Excellency Mr. Adnan Amin, CEO of the COP Presidency, COP28 Presidency team for the United Arab Emirates, to provide opening remarks. Mr. Adnan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam, and good afternoon, everybody. Let me say it's a great pleasure to be here and to be with colleagues from the Secretariat and from the IEA. Thank you very much for your very kind invitation to discuss, I think, which is one of the most critical elements of our coming negotiations on COP28, which is the decarbonization agenda, mitigation, and the energy transition. Let me emphasize to all of you from the outset that as a hydrocarbon producing country, the UAE understands the world's high expectations for the COP28 presidency to lead on the energy transition with high ambition. Let me assure you, if any of you have been reading the press, let me assure you that this is what we intend to do. We will put together a very ambitious program on mitigation. Those of you who are interested to know the reality of what we are doing in terms of achieving real change instead of ephemeral pledges, we're happy to engage with you in this discussion and to look at what the concrete outcomes of this will be that we will have on the table at COP28. We plan to build on the UAE's strong track record in this area, which includes growing Masdar into one of the world's largest renewable energy investors that is targeting a 100 gigawatt portfolio by 2030 of renewable energy. Over the last 15 years, the UAE has invested a total of $50 billion in renewable energy and clean tech globally, and plans to invest another $50 billion in the years ahead. And today, over 70% of our economy, which started as an economy which was 100% dependent on oil and gas, over 70% of our economy is diversified and 70% of GDP is generated outside of the oil sector. That is the speed of the transition that we have actually been on. We clearly recognize that the global stocktake is going to show that the world is well off the targets and ambitions of the Paris Agreement. And to keep the goal of holding temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the hard reality is that we are going to have an approach to global emissions that will cut global emissions by 43% by 2030. It's an unprecedented target. We have been discussing this with partners across the industry in different countries. We believe it's a highly ambitious target, but we believe it's an achievable target. To address that challenge, from our point of view, we must first accelerate our action on mitigation, and nowhere is this more important than the energy sector. What is abundantly clear is that we are in the midst of a very rapid energy transition, as the IEA will tell you. I used to be the former founding Director General of the International Renewable Energy Agency. We had many debates with the IEA. Some of you may be aware of them. And I'm very happy to see where the IEA is today. And I will not talk about the past. Today, solar PV and onshore wind power are the cheaper sources of new build power generation for at least 2/3 of the global population. And together, these technologies add record growth of 550 gigawatts between 2020 and 2022, and are on course to grow more over the next 5 years than the last 20 years combined. That is the speed of the renewable revolution that we are currently living through. This remarkable shift has been the result of concerted policy efforts and incentives, but we must move even faster. That is why COP28 is targeting a global goal to triple renewable energy capacity by 2030 and doubling hydrogen capacity by this time, and working on ambitious targets for energy efficiency. And in this effort, we have been in close consultation with the Executive Director of IEA, and are benefiting from the advice of Fatih Birol in this exercise. At the same time, even under the IPCC's 1.5 degree scenario, we know that oil and gas will play a diminished role in the future energy mix, but will be there to some extent. It's therefore critical that we rapidly decarbonize the industry, which is why for the first time, we want to bring the sector to the table at COP28 to bring them into a framework of accountability in front of the whole world, and to commit to verifiable and accountable targets over the coming time. This is a very different approach from the past, and let me digress on this a little bit with you, because there are a lot of questions around this and you all have very legitimate concerns. The oil and gas industry has always been at COPs. They have just never been at the table officially. They have always been part of delegations. We have been to COPs before in oil and gas producing countries. Those are the 2 last COPs, for instance. And they have always been present, but not officially interacting as entities that need to be responsible for climate change trends. We believe that it's time to bring them to the table, to commit to what they have to commit to for a climate-safe future for the world, and to show us what is the level of ambition they're willing to bring to the table, what are the technology solutions they're willing to deploy, what are the capital allocation decisions they're willing to make, and how they are going to contribute to the decarbonization of their operations. We feel this is essential. If you miss the entire industry that is responsible for the problem of emissions and do not discuss with them at the table, you will never come to a solution. Our approach, on the contrary, is to make them accountable to the international community in terms of what their future commitments are going to be. This includes alignment on accountable and measurable decarbonization targets, such as net zero emissions in Scope 1 and 2 by 2050. We are working on an ambitious 2030 target. That's much more difficult to achieve than a 2050 net zero target. We're trying to raise ambition on that. There's some intensive discussions going on around this, and we're hopeful that we will come with good news on that. We're committing to net zero methane emissions by 2030, which approximates to about a 0.2 intensity rate. We believe that this will remove substantial methane emissions from the table already in terms of concrete action. The energy transition simply isn't possible without a rapid acceleration of financial solutions. Despite global investment across energy technologies reaching a record high of $1.3 trillion in 2022, annual investment, in our view, must more than quadruple for us to remain on a 1.5 degrees centigrade pathway. Moreover, without adequate concessional finance to mobilize additional private finance, we simply won't achieve an energy transition that is either just or equitable. The Global South has a stake in this. We talk about decarbonization in global terms, but developing countries, take the example of Africa, an entire continent that has contributed 4% of global emissions, is being held to the same standards as the rest of the world, which has historical emissions that have consumed the carbon budget of the world at a huge rate. Is that equitable or just without providing financial solutions or investment or technology options to those countries to move to a sustainable future? Are we serious about decarbonization, or are we just talking to demonize people in the South who actually are in a process of development where real substantial issues of survival are on the table for many developing countries? That's something that we should think about, and we should think about it in a very honest way. We must ensure in this regard that every concessional dollar is matched by $2 to $3 of private capital. So on the one hand, increase the volume of concessional financing, its affordability and its accessibility, and its disbursement. And currently the institutional infrastructure responsible for that is not fit for purpose, which is why we are in a reform process. And as such, climate finance really has to enable developing countries to shift towards less carbon-intensive resources and leverage the enormous opportunities that exist with today's technology for green growth and green industrialization. I have worked a lot in the past on the African energy transition. There is a very clear narrative in the African context that industrialization is the pathway to growth, to sustainability, to creating employment and sustainable livelihoods for the people in Africa. Africa has competitive advantages there, but the energy scenario is what holds it back. They can either go the pathway of using carbon-intensive fuels, or the international community can, in solidarity, help to transition them with green industrialization. Let me say in conclusion, colleagues and friends, we want COP28 UAE to be remembered for uniting everyone in action. And nowhere is this more important than in the energy transition. We're looking forward to welcoming you all to COP28. I can assure you that COP28 will be one of the most inclusive COPs. We want it to be an action-oriented COP with clear outcomes. And we want it to be a COP where everybody has a safe space to express whatever views they want to put on the table and to participate in a vibrant conversation on climate change and our common future. We want to deliver a COP of unity, of solidarity, and of impact. And above all, a COP of action and a COP for all. We welcome you to COP28. I will not be able to stay long. If anybody wants to come back on this, I leave it to you, Madam Chair. But thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you, and we look forward to working with all of you to make COP28 a success in the coming year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Amin. We appreciate your opening remarks and linking the conversation that we're having today to the conversations that will ensue in the coming months and that we will most certainly continue at COP hosted by the United Arab Emirates. We understand that you might need to leave us at some point, so we thank you for joining us. To set the scene for our discussions, I will now like to invite our first keynote speaker, Mr. Thomas Spencer, who's a senior power sector modeler at the International Energy Agency. Thomas, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. At the outset, let me say on behalf of the IEA how delighted we are to co-organize this event with the UNFCCC. I'm delighted to be here also with the CEO of COP28. I'm very glad that you mentioned, Mr. Amin, the debates of the past, because they give us a sense of how fast the energy sector has moved. And this is what I would like to show with the few slides that I would present today. So let me start with the scene setter. Global emissions from energy rose 1% last year, reaching a new record high. This was perhaps less than we feared going into last year. Because of the global energy crisis, many feared that there would be a return to the burning of fossil fuels, in particular coal. This didn't happen, and in fact, as I will show, clean energy technologies had another record year last year. But still, we saw emissions rise, and we haven't yet seen a decisive peak. If we look at our stated policies scenario, where countries implement policies and regulations that are currently on the books, we actually do see, for the first time in last year's scenarios, global CO2 emissions peak and then start a slow decline. And the peak occurs this decade. So we see already in this scenario, with just current policies and the technology progress that we've seen up until now, global emissions peak this decade and then start to decline. But this scenario would lead to warming of 2.5 degrees Celsius by 2100, well above the Paris Agreement's goals. If we look at what countries have promised to do, but not yet put into policies or NDCs, the picture is quite different. Here, emissions would start to fall rapidly from today, and they would end 2050 at about 12 gigatons of CO2 from the energy sector compared to 36 gigatons today. In this scenario, if, and I want to underscore this if countries implement what they have promised to do, global warming would be limited to 1.7 degrees by 2100. But clearly we're not there yet. These pledges are not being translated into policies, and they are not being translated yet into NDCs, which we do include in our stated policies scenario. And more importantly, these pledges are not yet enough to put the energy sector on a pathway to reach net zero emissions by 2050, which would contribute to a global temperature increase of below 1.5 degrees by 2100. And I want to dwell just a little bit upon these so-called implementation gaps and ambition gaps a little bit in 2030. So if you look at the gap between stated policies and announced pledges, this is what the IEA calls the implementation gap. That gap in 2030, according to our analysis, is 5 billion tons of CO2. But if you look at the gap between announced pledges and our net zero emissions, or 1.5 degrees scenario, that gap is 8.5 billion tons of CO2. So the IEA's position is very clear. We need both to implement what we have promised to do, but also to raise ambitions. I'm also coming here with good news. Last year was another record year for clean energy technologies, and we saw this across the board. Let me give you a few examples. Electric vehicles reached a 15% market penetration in cars globally. So 15% of all cars sold were electric last year. This is up from 5% 2 years previously. In China in 2020, 1 in 20 cars was electric. Last year, after 3 years, it was 1 in 3. This transition is happening very quickly. If we look at another crucial technology, heat pump sales grew 11% last year, and in the United States, they overtook the sales of fossil fuel boilers for the first time last year. If we turn to renewables, we see another record year of renewables additions in the power sector with 330 gigawatts of capacity addition. Renewables covered 90% of electricity demand growth last year. But this year we see renewables reaching another peak. We project that this year capacity additions for renewables will be 440 gigawatts. And this means that in the renewables sector, the most important for limiting emissions in the near term, if we continue the current growth rate, at a global level, we are on track with the IEA's net zero emissions by 2050 scenario to 2030. Critical to continuing this progress is the issue of finance and investment. The IEA estimated that last year total clean energy investment across the energy sector, public, private, and all aspects of the energy sector was $1.7 trillion US. This is another record, and we estimate that this year we will see almost a revolutionary moment in the energy sector, with investments in solar PV surpassing upstream investments in oil production for the first time in history. I think we will look back on this in the future as a turning point. But we do see that these investments are not equally spread around the world. China is obviously a world leader in terms of clean energy technology deployment. We see new policies that are driving rapid investment growth in the European Union and the United States. We see increasing investment in India's solar PV sector, in Brazil's renewables sector. But despite these bright spots, it is still true that at the global level, 90% of the increase in clean energy investment has been driven by the advanced economies in China since 2019. And I want to give you one more data point that I would ask you to pay attention to. Since the Paris Agreement was signed, clean energy investment in real terms in emerging market and developing economies outside of China has stagnated. It has not increased. We need to change this dynamic if we are to meet our climate goals. Moving now to clean energy technologies. This is the picture that we could see in 2022 in terms of the manufacturing capacity globally for clean energy technologies for a range of critical clean energy technologies: solar PV, batteries, wind, heat pumps, and electrolyzers. And the unit here is as a percentage of what we need the manufacturing capacity to be in 2030 in order to meet the IEA's net zero by 2050 scenario. So you could see that at the end of 2022, installed manufacturing capacity was barely a fraction of where we need it to be in 2030 for these technologies. But if you look at the pipeline of projects, you can see that for a number of them, we are now approaching, if all of these projects are implemented, manufacturing capacity globally that would be sufficient to ensure that we have available supply to deploy these technologies at the rate required by our net zero scenario. This is what we need for our net zero scenario, and you can see that for solar PV and batteries, projected manufacturing capacity with announced projects would be sufficient to meet the needs of the net zero scenario. So the key message, I think, for policymakers is that the industry is ramping up very quickly. To give you a sense of just how quickly, pay attention to the dark blue line. This was our assessment of announced manufacturing projects at the end of last year. The light blue line is our assessment of announced manufacturing projects as of May 2023. So in 5 months, you can see the increase there. Last slide on what do we need to do to put the energy sector on track to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. What you can see here is the emissions reduction by key mitigation lever at world level in 2035 by mitigation lever. So the yellow is to meet announced pledges. So this is what countries have promised to do. And the green is to reach our net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. You can see that the key action is decarbonizing electricity generation, and I would argue that we have much of the technologies that we need to do that. But we also need action across the entire energy sector, in particular electrification through technologies like EVs, heat pumps, and so on, but also energy efficiency. Let me conclude just with a quick summary of what the IEA hopes to contribute this year. We will be producing a special report with the International Finance Corporation that will be published at the end of this month on this critical issue of how we can scale up investment in emerging market and developing economies for clean energy. There will be a series of reports. We've already published one on the role of the oil and gas sector, and we will be coming out with a special report on climate change in September, which we hope can be an important contribution to the global stocktake and to the success of COP 28. Thank you very much, and I'll hand it back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for both the inspiring as well as the sobering trends that you have shared with us. I will now like to invite our second keynote speaker, Mr. Bernd Hackman. Bernd is the team lead for NDC, LT-LEDs, and Sectorial Support Unit for the Mitigation Division at the UNFCCC. Bernd, welcome.
Thank you, Marianne. And yeah, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure being here for the Secretariat, teaming up with IEA, and talk about what is currently happening. Because before I want to start this, as strange as it sounds, but in this place, despite the critical role of energy, we haven't really talked about it. And I'll say a few words about that, but I think that this room is full is certainly testimony that there should be, maybe, certainly is a very, very clear link, and I'm happy to come back to that. But very often when I give presentations, I start with this slide. It is pretty much what Thomas also just said. So it's nothing new. It's a repetition, similar to also what His Excellency Mr. Amin said. It is kind of the reality of where we are. What you see here, and you see the lines are very similar to Thomas. Only we end them in 2030. We looked at all the NDCs. We assessed them all together, and we tried to understand where do they take us. And what you see is this red triangle. This is where, based on our assessment, the NDCs take us. IEA is with their approaches and tools. Also in that area, we have it maybe not so clear here because there are many uncertainties to it. But in general, this is pretty similar to what we just saw. What you see is above the red one is a gray shaded triangle. This is where we assessed back in the days the INDCs would take us. What is from that clear is that there is a massive improvement already in this short few years between what were the INDCs compared to where we are now with the NDCs. And the next NDCs will certainly come in 2025. Parties are mandated to present them and then also respond to the global stocktake. And we expect to see further improvements. So these are absolutely needed, as Thomas already said, because we are very far away from where we should be or we want to be. That is the dark blue scenarios are those associated with 2 degrees, and the green ones, or I think they're green. To me, they're green. They're associated with 1.5 degrees. What is very clear is we are by far not where we need to be. But also, as Thomas said, there's always a silver lining. We are already getting better, and getting better in a very short period of time. So that's something to keep in mind. And let me go to the next slide. Here's the same, just in numbers. Pretty much also what Thomas mentioned, what His Excellency mentioned. We also see that NDCs are very likely taking us to a peak, but this peak is not what you expect from a mountain. You reach the peak and then it sharply drops down. It's rather reaching something like a slowly downward moving plateau. So that's good because it's easier to walk down, but it's unfortunately not what we need. And as Dr. Nan said, we, according to the IPCC, have to reduce emissions by 2030 by 43% compared to 2019. And where we see it currently, we are currently at minus 0.3%. So this is the gap quantified that I showed earlier, that Thomas spoke about, that His Excellency also spoke about. And we also looked at where would that take us. And it would take us, Thomas, you mentioned it, around somewhere 2.5 degrees. That is really far from where we want to be. But when just looking back, also discussions prior to Paris, numbers around 4 degrees were circulating in the room. Again, we are making progress. So we are already, as previous speaker said, in this process of transition. We now just need to really speed it up. Let me go to the next slide. And initially I mentioned we haven't really spoken about this here in this context. Now we actually start doing it, and that's great. It's great to have this event. It's great to have many other events that are actually going in this direction, but it's even better that everywhere around the world this is being picked up. It's not only here, it's not only in the IEA, it is across the board with many, many stakeholders talking about this transition. And last year in Egypt, the COP also mentioned it for the first time, having a section on energy in a CMA decision, immediate, deep, rapid, sustained reductions in GHG emissions across all sectors, including for increase in low emission and renewable energy, rapidly transform energy systems, accelerating clean and just transition to renewable energy, and clean the energy mix. This doesn't sound very ambitious, but when you look back at a process that is there for 30 years, this is a big step. And I think we need to keep that in mind, take it as a stepping stone, and as His Excellency already mentioned, build on that in future COPs and in future sessions. And one thing I would like to highlight, we have already done so over the past couple of days, because another element that was operationalized during last COP in Egypt was the mitigation work program. And we had the first global dialogues here prior to this session, and certainly some of you were participating. And the topic of this year's dialogues is accelerating just energy transition. So we come out of meetings with many experts, stakeholders, governments, talking about opportunities, solutions, but also the challenges that are there, and starting this exchange. And certainly for colleagues from IEA, from colleagues from UAE, for many other colleagues, talking about energy is your daily bread and butter. For us, it is extremely exciting because finally we are doing this. And we see during this discussion that we are not talking about one transition. We're talking about many transitions. We are not talking about one technology. We are talking about many technologies, many sectors, many pathways, and especially, this needs to be just taking everyone on board, but also customized, really fitting the purpose of a country, bringing together priorities. So having this conversation is extremely important, because we are finally talking about what are we going to do? How do we do this? And this is a massive step forward. From, let's say, what happened over the last days, let me show you just 2 more slides, and that is we have another instrument under the Paris Agreement. One are the NDCs, you're very familiar with that. The other instrument are the long-term strategies. And in these long-term strategies, countries put out their plans towards net zero, towards low carbon emission futures until 2050 and beyond. And these documents, unlike the NDCs, are not binding, but they give a very clear direction. And what we can say, and I'm very happy to have this, so far we have analyzed in a report prior to last COP 53 of these. By now I think we have 62. But what I find very, very interesting and really telling is are the small graphs on the right-hand side. So the first one is GHG emissions with long-term and net zero targets currently around the world, we are covering already more than 80% of global emissions. So that means 80% of emissions are actually, and that is what Thomas said, if everyone lives up and implements this, going to disappear over time. This is massive. The next shows that those countries that have net zero targets already cover more than 90% of global GDP. That means this is not a niche product. This is not a handful of ambitious countries that would like to move forward. This is almost the entire world economy. And yeah, the others are different indicators that show that this is very, very important, that this is not a wishful thinking. And what I find here again impressive, and Thomas, you mentioned the speed by which this is happening right now, is back in Paris. The idea of these long-term strategies, and that was 2015, were, well, an utopia. People were focusing on negotiating NDCs, and no one, they said, yes, let's put in the long-term strategies, and everyone who would like to put something forward, please do so, but we are focusing on the NDCs. The other is an invitation. Only a few years later, not even 10 years later, these long-term targets cover more than 90% of the global GDP. This is clearly something to build on, and as Thomas said, these are so far promises on paper. They need to be implemented, so we need to talk about how to implement that, and further on then we need to see how we can bring everyone on board and make sure that all parts of society are part of this transition. But one last finding also from these long-term strategies, because net zero is more than just energy. Energy is more than just climate change. But this is just to show you, we looked at all these strategies, and on this slide you see how important the energy sector is. So every single one is tackling energy supply. Almost everyone is already thinking about transport. Everyone has references to buildings in their industry, almost everyone. So you see that countries are thinking across their entire economy when talking about decarbonization. Just to be fair to also the other sectors, of course, agriculture is absolutely critical in this regard. On one end for mitigation, on the other end for adaptation, but most importantly for food security. Same with forests and LULUCF. Everyone knows that our forests play a critical role on that. Waste sector is also highly mentioned. So it is clear that these are really comprehensive documents, and now we need to talk about how to implement them, and I'm happy to be part of today's event, and I'm looking forward to many, many more of such events and of bringing different communities together and moving this agenda, moving this program forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bernd. So now with this framing provided by both Bernd and Thomas, we're going to move on to the panel discussion. So I'm very glad to introduce the panel that we have today. So we have Ms. Jenny Macher, Head of the Division of Climate Change of the Ministry of Environment of Chile, and Mr. Damião Victor Namuera, Chief of the Department of Renewable Energy of the Ministry of Mineral Resources and Energy of Mozambique, who will join the panel discussion now with Thomas, who has rejoined us. So let us get started. I will first like to come back to the question of raising ambition. So Jenny, I would like to start with you. So Chile has made significant progress in enhancing ambition for mitigation. It updated its NDC with a more ambitious target for unconditional absolute indicators in 2020 and became the first Latin American country to submit a long-term strategy to the UNFCCC. In June 2022, Chile announced a net zero GHG target for 2050 and enshrined it in the framework law on climate change. So Jenny, this is impressive. Can you please tell us what was the strongest enabling factor which made your country keep pursuing more and more ambitious targets for mitigation? And how did the energy sector in particular contribute to the ambition enhancement?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Well, regarding to your question, for Chile, in the last few years, transparency and the climate action was one of the key issues that moved political and scientific information in the country. So for that reason, we have been preparing very good report under the UNFCCC. The BORs were submitted all on time. And what happened with that, we started to realize with this information that we have very good system to put in place measures as well, not only good system to gather information. So we started to work especially with academia and also with the private sector, and we built some link with them in order to have better, for example, GHG inventories. When we had that, we designed new NDC. We presented updated NDC based on science, on scientific information on 2020. So in that NDC, we already had projections to how to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. So that's happened because we realized with the data that we have that it could be perfectly possible if we started to work on time. As I always say that when you talk for example, when you are planning measures in economy, you work a lot with present value, right? Well, in climate is something similar. You have to have your goals and bring them to the present and say, okay, what I need to do now in order to reach a future goal. So energy sector is part of our national system for GHG emissions report. And the energy sector is very special in Chile because it's the major emitter. But it's special because in the middle of the 90s, we were super dependent on fossil fuel. We don't have fossil fuel, so we exported all of them. And we had a very huge crisis in the middle of the 90s. So we decided that we cannot be more so dependent of fossil fuels. And we started to push renewable energies. We created a law of renewable energy. Every company that generates electricity in Chile had to be a quota of renewable. And that kind of policies push a lot the sector. And when we analyzed the NDC in 2020, we realized that energy sector, especially for renewables, it was very easy to work with. I mean, the companies are really willing to work towards having net zero in that sector in particular. So it was all, trying to summarize a little bit, I think all was based on having good information and having good link with the right sector that are involved, and also with the companies that are involved as well.
Thank you very much, Jenny. And I think it's very interesting to see how certain conditions that the country had combined with a crisis in a way prompted changes that then you leveraged to then drive that ambition forward, and then how that ambition built with science further ambition. So thank you for that. Damião, now I would like to turn to you and would like to ask you on this question of raising ambition. It is very much also tied with the question of international support in order to be able to set that ambition and then realize it. So my question to you is, how can the international community support the enhancement of ambition in developing and emerging economies?
Thank you. Mozambique is a development countries, and the challenge in the development countries, I think, is the same in the all development countries. The government are made all can do to develop a project to enhance our projects, but that challenge the government have is related with the give food populations, to give electricity populations, and so on and so on. But some activity or some project we made, sometime we face a problem of finance. Sometimes we develop a project with our own budgets, but we get a hurricane that put our effort not in front. But we have made our what we can do. But I think, for example, in Mozambique, we have a lot of resource. We have a lot of energy. I can say resource. But to deploy, to develop this resource, we need support, finance support. I think the international cooperation can help these Mozambique and the developing countries to develop our resource, to develop projects to bring more sustainable for these countries.
Thank you. So thank you with your intervention, also leading us to the question of implementation, which I think is key. So as stated by Damião, setting up ambitious targets needs to be followed by robust implementation of mitigation measures, and that needs to be done with both domestic resources and with international support. So Thomas, it would be great if you could share with us some of the key actions that countries can take to put the world on track with 1.5 degrees in the energy sector. What are some of those?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question. So I'll focus on the short term, and we have to remember that from the energy sector's perspective, 2030 is already very close. It is a sector that operates with long planning periods, long project implementation times, and long asset lifetimes. And so that means that what we can do between today and 2030 really is constrained by available technologies and these long development lifetimes for some of the large-scale projects. The good news is that we have all of the necessary technologies to put the world on something like the IEA's net zero by 2050 pathway to 2030, so to the near term. I would say that the key measures can sort of be divided into maybe 3 or 4 buckets. The first one is in the electricity sector, scaling up the deployment of renewable and other low emission sources of technologies. Renewables can be deployed very quickly. They're modular, they can be scaled very quickly. And we are seeing this in a number of countries that have, in the space of 3 or 4 years, really transformed their power sector. Of course, we will need other low emissions generation technologies, particular to balance variable renewables. So it's not just a story, but it is clear that renewables in the electricity sector are a key part of the puzzle, and they can be deployed very quickly. The second bucket is around energy efficiency. And this is a quite broad category, because in energy efficiency, the IEA puts what you could call technical efficiency. So this is improving, for example, minimum performance standards for energy consuming equipment. This is really critical, for example, in developing economies which face large demand growth for cooling in the household sector. It's absolutely critical that those new air conditioning units are put in as efficiently as possible. Otherwise, we will see an explosion of electricity demand. but it's also things like a circular economy, reducing our use of energy-intensive materials, and in particular in instances of high per capita consumption, the IEA also looks at behavioral change. So this can be things like turning down thermostats if you have your air conditioning running. If you have your heating running, turning up thermostats if you have your air conditioning running. So that's the sort of energy efficiency bucket. Then there's acting on short-lived climate pollutants. Actually, in the IEA's net zero emissions scenario, by 2050, 40% of the reduction in peak warming between the IEA's net zero emissions scenario and the stated policy scenario comes not from CO2 but from methane. And so acting on these short-lived climate pollutants like methane is absolutely critical to lowering peak warming and giving us a fighting chance of still being below a high overshoot of 1.5 degrees. And then the fourth bucket is preparing the next steps, because 2030 is only one step on the pathway to net zero. So this includes innovation in clean energy technologies. It involves starting to scale up and rapidly deploy some of the technologies that become more and more important after 2030. These include technologies like carbon capture and storage, and carbon capture and use, which in our analysis don't make a big dent on emissions by 2030, but you have to start scaling them now so that they can play a role after 2030. Similarly for hydrogen, also doesn't make a huge impact on emissions, but we need it to be in place so that it can play that role after 2030. So those are the sort of four buckets that we think are at the IEA.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Very, very clear. A lot of inspiration for actions that can be taken now, for benefits that can accrue in the short term, but also the foundations for the long-term transition, both of them important. Jenny, I want to turn back to you. Building on the comments that Thomas has shared, from your perspective in Chile, where do you see the greatest opportunities and challenges for the energy sector in its implementation towards the net zero targets?
Thank you. Well, as mentioned before, we had a huge renewable market now. So the challenge are related with mostly with storage, because we don't want to depend so much on fossil fuels and thermoelectric. So the idea is to improve our technology and have a good capacity for storage. But for that, we need to improve also the transmission system in the country. So now that are the huge and the closest challenges that we have in that sector in particular. But one key issue, I think, and is important for every country, is also talking about just transition. I mean, we have to we have to assure that all these transitions have to occur moving, but not leaving nothing behind. I mean, nobody behind. It is really important to work on education, work on new jobs, and work on creating capacities to move as faster as we need, especially in these kind of issues. And for us, we had also new challenges to develop, for example, new kind of industries like green hydrogen, but those are difficult for us because we are not like a technology developing country. However, we are trying to put all the conditions together in order to attract investment and having this industry very soon in the country. And I wanted to mention something, just having your comment related with methane. Chile last year presented an enhanced NDC under the convention. We put a new goal related with methane because we are very aware that methane is one of the key problems that we need to address in the next few years. For that reason, we commit to stop the trend that we have. Of course, like every country, we have a rising trend of methane, and we commit to stop that at early as 2025. And we also wanted to encourage other countries to look solutions related with methane, because I wanted to say something very unpolite, but after the Glasgow Pact, we expected to have more enhanced NDC in the table, and we didn't see that. So we did a huge effort to do that, and we wanted to see our partner also do the same.
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you for bringing. I think that we're getting these complementary perspectives, right? Some of the measures that can be taken, but also the more hard infrastructure implications of the changes, but also the social implications of the changes that need to be put in place. And the reminder that we are in all of this together, and that countries, we need all countries, around the world to be transitioning their economies as well. But this requires cooperation, right? And so with that, Damião, I wanted to come back to you. Mozambique's NDC proposes to achieve a reduction of GHG emissions by 40 million tons of CO2 by 2025. And to achieve this target, the investment that is needed is around 7.6 billion. So how do you see the role of international climate finance to achieve this goal? And can you provide one example of how international climate finance is supporting renewable energy deployment in Mozambique? And then people can approach you to learn about the many others.
Thank you. Since 2014, the government of Mozambique changed our regulatory framework and give more renewable targets, and ODS, include ODS in our regulatory frameworks. And this brings more opportunity to give in our matrix more renewables, more renewable projects. That's in our country. We have now in 2 solar median projects in place. We have also some program with renewable targets. We call Prolaris. And then the GEF financing some project in Mozambique regarding with the solar home system or biomass projects, and we call biomass projects and cook stove projects. But we have other support come for the environment support. For example, World Bank support also the Energy for All programs in Mozambique. In 2019, the electrify percent in Mozambique was 34. Now the percentage is like 48. That is the comfort support of the World Bank and the other institutions.
Thank you. And thank you for the several examples of areas in which your Mozambique is already taking action with international support to really deploy renewable energy in Mozambique. So Thomas, very briefly, I would like to ask you the last question. So in addition to the measures that we've discussed so far, innovative technologies will also be needed for implementation towards the 1.5 degree goal. Do we have the right technologies to be able to achieve the 1.5 degree pathway, aligned pathway?
So when the IEA models its 1.5 degrees pathway, we don't assume any fundamental breakthroughs in technologies that are not already at prototype or conceptual stage today. So we don't assume, for example, that fusion reactors become a commercial reality within the time frame of our scenario. Having said this, in 2021, when we first released our net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, we estimated that slightly less than 50%, about 45% of the emissions reductions that we needed by 2050 to have net zero emissions from the energy sector by that date came from technologies that were only at prototype or demonstration phase. I'm not going to spoil things, but we're currently redoing this analysis, and we will present it in our special report on climate change in September. But I think we will have a good news message, which is that that number will have fallen because we have made progress on demonstrating and commercializing technologies like green hydrogen, like fuel cell vehicles in the heavy-duty transport sector, like electrification of industrial sectors that previously only used thermal energy from fossil fuel combustion. So the short answer is we don't assume any fundamental breakthroughs, but we still need a lot of effort on commercialization and demonstration. But we are seeing progress. We are seeing encouraging progress on innovation, and stay tuned for an important message from us in September this year.
Thank you. Thank you, Thomas. Okay, so now we would like to open the floor for questions for the audience. We have a few minutes to be able to do this. I see a hand going up. We have already a couple of hands. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I'm Claire Feisen from Climate Analytics. I have a question for Thomas. Thank you for your presentation, first of all, everyone. One question. In the announced pledges scenario, you said that heads for 1.7 degrees at the end of the century. Is that then still rising after 2100? Does it achieve? I know it's only an energy sector, I wondered what you can say about that. And also if you can add anything, given what Jenny was saying about how governments haven't brought forward, or how many governments haven't brought forward new NDCs, what following the announced pledges scenario would mean for our ability to limit warming to 1.5. Thank you.
We can do that. I think that the microphone has to move around physically, so maybe go ahead and address the first question.
Thank you. First of all, I'm Essen from the Dutch delegation as an NGO representative, and I had a question. When energy has to be fit for purpose for every country, isn't it really important to also include energy reduction? And I don't hear it back anywhere, and I think there should be a strategy for it, especially for the developed world. So I was wondering on your thoughts about that.
Thank you. So let's answer these two questions, and then we'll include one more.
So on the first question, whether the temperature would still be rising after 2100, the short answer is yes, because CO2 emissions in that scenario have not reached net zero by 2100. And so although we stop the climate model that we run in the IEA at 2100 and then output the temperature results from that model, if you continue to run it after 2100, the temperature would continue to rise. On your question of sort of what would following the APS mean for our chances of meeting the net zero emissions scenario by 2050, I would even put it the other way around. What would following the stated policy scenario mean for meeting the net zero emissions by 2050 scenario? Because as our stated policy scenario shows very clearly, we are not on track with announced pledges. So it's very clear that to be on track with our net zero scenario, countries would need to enhance their domestic policies. They would need to enhance the implementation of current policies. They would need to announce more ambitious policies, but also more ambitious NDCs, and in some cases more ambitious net zero targets as well.
And any feedback on the second question?
Oh, I didn't want to be the one answering them all, but the IEA does model a variety of strategies to reduce energy demand in our scenarios, including energy efficiency, so improving the efficiency of equipment, what you can call circular economy, so recycling and so on. And I can see you shaking your head, what you would call energy reduction, or what we call behavior change. So this would include, for example, flying less for business purposes, reducing thermostats if you're heating your building. Pure behavior change we do model in our scenario.
Thank you. We have time for some more questions, so let me see the hands. Okay, let's take these two, which I see closer together. They will be answered, and then we'll take, I think there are a couple in the middle and the back.
I'm Tejal from the Indian delegation. So if you could elaborate a little bit more about the regional assumptions in the 1.5 degrees Celsius scenarios. Is there any equity in those assumptions at all? Because we've seen with the IPCC scenarios that they egregiously violate equity and principles of justice, restricting sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia to very low levels of energy and income. So is this sort of corrected in the IEA scenario? Also another question on the Afolu sector mitigation, because that's around 20 to 30% of mitigation comes from there. And again, in the IPCC scenarios, it's very clear that this increases the risk of hunger and food insecurity in the developing countries, because 80% of the land-based mitigation is in developing countries. So do you correct for some of this, these oversights and gaps in the IPCC scenarios and the IEA scenario?
Hi everyone, my name is Bas from the International Trade Union Confederation. A question for the Honorable Representative of Chile. You mentioned just transition. Can you maybe share a few thoughts on how putting workers front and center in that just transition could help close the implementation gap? Thanks.
So maybe on the first question to you, Thomas, and then I think the question for workers he could come to.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Tejal, for the question. I'm very glad you asked it. I saw your paper actually on IPCC scenarios. I think it's a very important contribution. So firstly, a little note on the way that we do our modeling. First of all, we don't implement any cross-country common solution like a common carbon price, which is used in a lot of IPCC scenarios, that then allocate abatement on some estimation of where it would be cheapest. We don't do that. We model each region or country individually. And so the global results that you can see are a composite. They are the sum of these individual region and country models. So that's the first point. The second point is that in our net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, we integrate equity in the sense that advanced economies go first. They reach a lot of the milestones in that scenario well before emerging market and developing economies. They reach net zero well before emerging market and developing economies. And they reach net negative emissions before emerging market and developing economies. And in fact, as an aggregate, in that scenario, emerging market and developing economies are not quite at net zero by 2050. And the global net zero is achieved by the fact that advanced economies are below net zero. In this scenario, we ensure that the SDG goals of energy access for those parts of the population currently lacking access to modern energy are met. And we impose no external constraints on per capita energy demand and so on. What I will say is, however, that this pathway is extremely rapid and challenging for emerging market and developing economies. We absolutely shouldn't gloss over that fact. And getting there, as we have highlighted in the reports that have presented this scenario, will require global cooperation, including technology and finance, to support that pathway. I think you can see sort of a proxy in the way that we integrate equity, in the way that you can see emissions reductions by fuel, for example. So if you compare the IEA's net zero emissions by 2030 scenario in 2030 to IPCC scenarios we have of comparable climate ambition. So IEA versus IPCC scenarios of comparable climate ambition. We have much stronger reductions in oil and gas consumption because mostly they are used in countries and sectors like advanced economies, in the transport sector, in the building sector, in advanced economies. And because we are going rapidly there, you see more reductions in oil and gas demand relative to IPCC scenarios in the IEA's net zero emissions scenario. And you see comparatively less in coal demand because most of coal consumption, 2/3 of coal consumption occurs outside of the advanced economies. So you can see this as sort of a proxy of how we compare. But I won't hide the fact it's a challenging thing, and that's simply a consequence of where we are today and the limited carbon budget that we have remaining.
Any feedback on the second question? Jenny?
Yeah, I would like to clarify that just transition is not only about jobs and only social aspect, because sometimes we are like stick with that, like we need to create jobs and stuff. In Chile, we are working now in a new kind of concept called ecological and social just transition. And what that means is that, for example, in places that where do you have a huge industries, after the closure of that kind of industries, for example, coal power plant, you have to work not only in creating capacities for the worker that were there and trying to help them to work in another more sustainable area, like for example renewables and on that, but also you have to work from the ecological part as well. With reparation and also with measures of compensate the damage that the ecological part of that territory has suffered. And in that matter, you can join with social measures and with green jobs. This both approaches. You can help and create capacities on work on that kind of issues, like I don't know how to say restoration. Thank you. Yeah, on restoration, for example. So the approach that we are trying to take is like that. Is having not only jobs but also work on an ecological part as well. I don't know if it's a good example or not, but.
Thank you. So unfortunately, we're going to need to wrap up in respecting everybody's times, but also that there are more events coming after us. So I just wanted to share that the course of today's discussion provided the space to show how important the role of the global energy sector is for the transition and what lies ahead on the road to achieve a 1.5-degree target. As you have seen, we've delved into policy, finance, and technology perspectives that are involved in the energy transition that needs to happen. I want to thank our distinguished speakers for lending their perspective, their insight, and their expertise to this event. I want to thank you for joining us today and asking questions. And in closing, it is the hope of the IEA and the UNFCCC that events such as this will inspire stronger ambition to act collectively and grow the momentum for increased effort and action to support clean energy for all. So with that, we thank you all and have a good afternoon.